In the workshop today we've got this beautiful Sabina juniper. Now this was collected in Spain about 5, maybe 6 years ago, and it's been in this pot ever since. Junipers can take quite a while to re-establish when they've been collected, but this has done fine. So there are areas on this tree where we've got growth like this for the season. The colour is good, uniform all over, it's drinking water regularly, so I'm now happy that we can do the first stage on this. Now this is not your first this is not a repotting in the conventional sense. What we've got to do is clean this root system out and then remove what parts of it we can, get rid of all the old mountain soil, and then this is going to go into an oversized bonsai pot. It's the first stage in the development of this tree as bonsai. As you can see, it's had no training whatsoever, but the most important thing in any bonsai tree is the root system. Now when you have collected trees, assuming they come out of the ground with any sort of root ball, lump of soil, clay, whatever it might be, that goes into the pot. The tree will then root into the new soil that's put around it, but you tend to find that core of soil that came out of the mountains or came out of the ground doesn't tend to produce particularly good fibrous root. So what we're doing on this tree today is starting the process of building a bonsai root system, and so I just wanted to let you have a look at this and see how we go with this type of work. So the first thing is to get this out of the pot. Now it's a mistake to just grab the trunk and try and lift it out, especially with the Yamadori, because particularly with this we have no idea what's in the soil, and it could quite easily just have one live vein with all the root on it, and by picking it up you could easily disturb that. So what we need to do is basically roll this out of the pot. So the first thing to do is to make sure there's no securing wires inside. There is a little bit here, but we get rid of that. And then all we need to do is give this a shake, and then we can just tip that. Slide that out. So just having a quick look at this, you can see there's a lot of root here. The white root is weeds. We had a lot of weeds in this pot, which I've obviously cleaned out. So the white stuff is weeds, but the red stuff you can see there, that's all juniper. Now we've given this tree 2 or 3 days to dry out. That makes working a lot easier and a lot more pleasant. You can see here where the trunk goes into the root, it's hard to tell into the root ball. Hard to tell what's going on, but we'll figure that out eventually. We've got some nice deadwood on here, and just look at this lovely growth. In bonsai you always have to be guided by the tree, and this work can be done now. The tree is very healthy. It's mid-September, good time for repotting junipers in the UK. So let's get on and get this root ball cleaned out. So we're not going to need much to do this work. We've got a rake, tweezer, a pair of scissors. We're not going to be removing a lot of root from this. We're going to try and gather it all up and put it back in a pot. Now when you use a rake, this type of thing, or a small one like this, it's important that we don't tear the root system. It's very easy for these tines to get in there and just rip through. We don't want to do that. So the way that we use one of these is to use it pushing the tines gently into the soil, and then basically just fluffing it up so that the soil falls out, but we're not tearing any root at all. It takes a little time, but especially with this first repotting we need to keep as much of this root as we can, and then we're going to gather up more or less all of it and put that all back in the pot. You usually find when you start the outside of the root ball is quite dense, so it's quite difficult to get into, because typically the roots form around the outside of the pot where it's warmest and conditions are most suitable for the development of roots. Once we get inside here, a little bit further in, a couple of inches in, we find that it all starts to come apart a lot easier. So what I'm going to do is work all the way around the outside of this, remove as much weight as I can, then we can roll it over and then really start to get into this core. You can see how you just fancy bit of wrist action on this, and you can see the soil just falls out, and here's all the root nicely left behind. We've got one or two big roots here, obviously we want to keep all those. We're just careful, we don't want to be tearing anything or pulling anything apart. This needs to be a very gentle piece of work, especially with this first repotting. And also, when you've not repotted a tree before, you never know exactly what you're going to come across. So just work slowly, gradually, and just keep pulling that soil out little by little. You can feel the points on the rake where they hit the harder material. You just go gently and draw it across, and all that soil particles just fall out really easily without any problem at all. As you can see, we've got mountains of root here. Tree's done really well. As I say, Sabinas, most junipers in the UK tend to grow quite slowly, and it does take a while to build a root system. As you notice, I've got a lot of material here and I'm sort of working amongst it. I'm not going to prune this as I go, because where you have a situation like this tree is in, we've got quite a core of mountain soil here. And like I said earlier, that won't produce as good quality, dense, fibrous root as this nice mix of pumice and bark that's around the outside. So if we were to prune a lot of this away, and then when we get to the middle there's a lot less root, so I like to get this all cleaned out before I actually remove any root. So then I know where everything is, what I've got, and at this point I want to keep as much as we possibly can. A bonsai root system should not consist of any significant amount of wood. It should just be this fine fibrous material, because that's what the tree's going to live off of. And junipers are very obliging in that respect. Unlike deciduous trees, they don't tend to run round and round and round the outside of the pot. They do make a nice, well divided and fibrous root system, and you can really see how much of it we've got here. There's absolutely loads. So in the bottom here, I'm now down to the original mountain soil. So pretty much all this nice pumice mix is gone. Looking from the side, you can see we've already got a fairly shallow root system with this. So this part here is all original mountain soil, and rather than using the big rake for that, I'm going to use this rake tweezer. The end of that, two nice points, and that you can push into that mountain soil, break it up, and then just flick it out quite easily without too much of a combing through that you would perhaps with the rake. So we just leave this open underneath, and as you can see, all that clay is just falling out. Because I dried the root ball out for a few days before we started this clay is coming out nicely. If it was wet, it really wouldn't fall out, and it would be a much more difficult job. So if you're going to repot a tree like this, always dry it out a bit before you get in and get started. Makes the work easier, and it makes it a sight more pleasant than digging through soggy mud. And also, if it's dry, the soil does come out easier, and so there's less damage to the roots. So this is time consuming, picking this clay out. It's much more difficult than that nice pumice mix that was on the outside. As I said, you can see here we've got still quite a big area, and all of this is mountain soil, so it's going to take me a while to pick through this. It's important that we clean this all out, so that when it goes into a bonsai pot, we've got more or less the same soil mix all the way through, which ensures equal drainage all over. We don't get wet and dry spots, and it just helps that fibrous root system to develop much more evenly, and ultimately you end up with a healthier and much stronger tree. But you can see this clay now, it's not falling out anything like as easy as that first material was. So like I say, this is a perfect tool for doing this job. now got this soil all cleaned out. You can see there's nothing here but root. Picked out all the weed root, and you can see there's a lot more here we're going to need to put into a pot. So what I'm going to do is just sharp scissors. There's no big roots here, so we're not in danger of removing anything that we might need particularly. So that's only a small amount, as you can see, but it's the longest stuff. What this will do is encourage new roots to develop closer to the trunk, and that actually reinvigorates the tree once it gets going again in 2 or 3 weeks. So now we've got that ready, all nicely cleaned out, trimmed up, so now we can start looking for a pot to put this into. So this is the pot we're going to use. It's got a reasonable amount of depth to it. I find that junipers do much better in deeper pots, especially at this early stage. The deeper the pot, the better the root development you're going to get. Perhaps in the future this will go into a shallow pot, doesn't really matter at the moment, because obviously this is the first repot, so the style of the pot is less important than the depth. And then a little bit of soil in the bottom there just to cover the bottom, and I've got the securing wires. Make sure that you use a good caliper of wire, don't use anything too thin, because we want to make sure that's secured nice and tightly once it's finished. Here we just want to get this loosely secured while we rearrange the roots, get some soil in there, and gradually as we go it'll firm up. The easiest job on your own. What it is. Just prop that in the back. Hopefully you can see that's nicely positioned there. So now I can start to rearrange the roots and gradually work some soil in there, and as I do, it will firm up, and then we'll gradually, slowly reposition it to where I want it to end up. So now we just little by little bit of soil, work close to the trunk to begin with. It's easy to work the soil in around the outside, but it's in the core in the middle where we really need to get this worked in. So just a little stick, and little by little we'll just work that all in. Get your hands in there, you can feel what's going on. That soil nicely worked in. Try not to just squash all the roots in a bunch. You want to work the soil between the roots, and that keeps everything nice and open, stops you getting wet spots, and it'll ultimately help the new roots to develop. As you work the soil in with the stick, if you just lift and twist and turn and just move the roots in much the same way as we took the soil out with the little tweezer, we lift the roots, and so make sure the roots aren't all just compressed into the bottom, but they're all equally spread throughout the soil mix. There's always little cavities underneath, and very often just getting your fingers in there is the best way to get those nicely filled. With bonsai, it's everything we do in bonsai is part of the gradual progression and development of a tree, especially from wild or collected Yamadori material, this type of thing. It takes a while to develop the foliage. Once you've got the foliage, you can then start to build the branch structure and progressively start to put some style into the tree. But at the same time you're developing the top of the tree, obviously the root system is developing, and so the whole tree progresses forwards little by little. This part of the tree is a little bit lower than I want it to be, so if I just lift it from the top, you can see that comes up, and then as it does, you can just take the stick put the soil underneath it, more around. And when we let go, you see it stays exactly where it's put. In this position you can see we've got a large what was a branch here which has got some roots on it. There's another piece here which is coming off the end of this live vein here, so this is quite important, we need to keep this. There's also one or two small bits that we can remove, and I'm just using a little block of wood here. There's a little dead root there. We're just using that to hold that in position while we get in and sort these roots out. Basically what we want to do is just draw these roots down into the soil underneath. There's quite a bit of space under here, so we can get right under there, make sure that soil is tightly packed right underneath the base of that trunk. So we've got lots of space there we can bring this root into. Now where this root here, like I say, that comes off the bottom of this main live vein, so it's quite an important root, so I'm not going to just cut that off. But what I want to do is got a little dead piece on the end here. I want to pull that into the soil, so what I'm going to do is just take a small wire, pull it up from one of the drainage holes underneath, secure it to the wires underneath, hook that over there, and then just tie that down into the soil, and that will hold that, and then it will establish in that position. So I've got a wire through the drainage hole. Here it's secured to the little dead stub. I just take the wire from there, pull that down, and you can see that pulls that root nicely into position in the soil where we want to keep it, and then just hook that around the wire underneath the pot, and then that'll stay where it is. And now that little one's secured in place, I'm just going to tighten this one down here onto this dead stub, and that should secure everything up quite nicely. In the future I'm confident that we can remove this, but for the first repotting I'm going to keep it, because every root helps to get this tree established. Take that off there, and you can see that's pretty solid in there now. Just here you can see the securing wire is going to run over this live vein. Obviously we don't want to compress that because that's going to cause damage. So what I like to use for that, piece of rubber cooling hose from a car. It's really thick, so it gives lots of protection for that while this securing wire is doing its job. Just pop that under there, hold that all in position, and pull, twist. Just go around the edge of the pot, slide the stick down to the bottom, and then just pull it away. What that does is allow the soil to fall between the pot and the roots, and so long as the roots are nicely mixed within the soil, you'll tend to get a rapid root development. We don't want just the roots all squished up against the side of the pot where they'll tend to get quite wet. So just running down the side like that, just moving the stick inwards, and it allows the soil to go down between the roots and the pot. At this point you get your fingers in here, and that'll actually you'll be able to feel very easily where there are any voids, soft areas, so you can then work that soil in with the stick, and gradually you'll feel the whole thing start to firm up. Obviously on the top it's quite loose, but if you get your fingers in there, it's much better than just using the stick, because you can really feel what's going on, so you can get that soil nice and evenly packed all the way through. The more evenly this is done and the more consistent the root ball is, the better development of fine roots we're going to get. But for this first repot we want to keep as much root as we can, and that'll help the recovery. And working at this time of year, as I said, it's mid-September, Junipers make most of their root in the second half of the year. This is actively making root, so it'll be recovered and well established at this time of year within about a month, because it's still reasonably warm, it's humid, the nights are not too cold, and so this tree is going to certainly be developing roots up to the first sort of decent frost. And then finally you need one of these, just a little rubber mallet, just give that a gentle tap, hold the tree in position while you do. If there's any little pockets in there that you missed, that helps to settle that all in. And also if you put your fingers on top as you tap in the pot, the soil will just bed in nicely with the vibration. Obviously don't hit the pot too hard. Just a nice gentle tap, just enough to vibrate that soil. And now this is not going down anymore, this is nicely and evenly packed. So now I'll just come around the back here and finish that piece. Now finished with this juniper. As you saw from the watering, we just flood that until the water runs nice and clear out of the bottom. That helps to remove any dust that was in that soil mix. Because it's mid-September here in the UK, autumn is beginning. The days are still mild and it's still very pleasant. But this is going to go into the polytunnel for the winter, and the reason for that is so that I can control the moisture level in this soil. If I was to leave it outside, it's quite feasible it could end up getting too wet if there's much rain, and I don't want that. I want to just keep it just moist, not dry, not wet, just in the middle, and that gives optimum conditions for the new roots to develop. It also helps me to keep the wind off, which helps to stop the foliage desiccating, and so this tree will develop really quickly now, and it'll stay in the polytunnel for winter. By the end of the winter, early spring, it'll go back outside and it'll grow away as though nothing happened at all. It'll be perfectly happy. So hopefully this has given you some insight into the initial repotting of this juniper. As I said, it's really important to get into that core and get that clay out. So now we've got uniform drainage and a uniform soil throughout the root ball. We've still got a few issues to deal with here in the back, but that can be done in time. The foliage is not touched. This will now be left alone for 2 to 3 years, depending on how it grows. And then we can start to look at the next stages of how we're going to develop this tree as bonsai. But hopefully this has given you some insight into this initial repotting of a Yamadori tree into its first bonsai pot. So thanks for watching.